All right. We all think we know what the law is, right? It's a bunch of rules, some judges, gavels. But what if I told you it's also a powerful tool for social engineering, a system that some people say is built to protect the powerful, and a system that's constantly wrestling with its own very human flaws? Today, we are going way beyond the gavel to really unpack the hidden architecture of justice.
You know, we tend to look at the law as this giant, fixed rulebook for how society should run. But is that really all it is? Or is it something a lot more alive? A dynamic system that's constantly being shaped by human conflict, by deep philosophy, and by some pretty intense debates. To get a handle on that, we've got to start on the ground floor.
So let's do it. Let's start right there on the ground floor, with the real nuts and bolts of how the legal system actually works, day in and day out. And the very first thing the system does is sort every single problem into one of two big buckets. And believe me, the difference between them is absolutely everything.
Okay, first up you've got criminal law. This is the stuff you see in all the TV dramas. It's the state, the government versus a person. The whole point here is punishment for breaking a big societal rule. But then you've got civil law, and this is all about disputes between people or between companies. Think about things like a broken contract or an argument over a property line. In this case, the goal isn't jail time, it's about making things right, and that usually means with money. So the question is always, is this society's fight, or is it a private one?
Now, in any of these cases, whether it's criminal or civil, the system has to answer a really important question. Who has to prove their story? This is what's called the burden of proof. There's this ancient Latin principle, onus probandi. It's basically a rule of fairness. If you're the one making the accusation, you have to be the one to back it up with evidence. It's not on me to prove I didn't do something you accuse me of, and that simple idea, it's one of the most important pillars of modern justice.
Okay, so we've seen the basic machinery, how the parts move. But now we're heading down into the engine room. Because just beneath the surface of all those rules, there are these huge, raging philosophical battles about what the law is even for. And this, my friends, is where things get really, really interesting.
So let me throw a pretty radical idea at you, one that challenges everything we just talked about. There's this school of thought called critical legal studies, and they argue that the law is not some neutral referee. Not even close. They claim it's actually a system that's been designed from the ground up to protect the status quo, to lock in society's existing power structures and biases. It's an idea that just completely flips the script on the whole concept of impartial justice. So how does that critique actually work? Well, CLS scholars say, look, judges aren't just robots applying rules. Their decisions are always, in a way, political. They argue that the law, more often than not, ends up serving the interests of the wealthy and powerful. They also point out that legal texts themselves are just full of contradictions. But maybe their biggest challenge is to this idea of the autonomous individual. The law kind of pretends we're all these free agents making our own independent choices, when, in reality, our lives are deeply, deeply shaped by our social and economic situations.
So, if the law isn't this perfect, neutral rulebook, can we use it for something else? I mean, can it actually become a tool, not just for settling arguments about the past, but for actively designing a better future? Well, that question takes us up to the architect's office, where the law is treated like a blueprint for real social change.
And this is the whole idea behind something called public interest litigation, or PIL. A PIL is a lawsuit that's way bigger than just one person. Instead of fighting for a single client, a PIL takes on a huge, systemic issue on behalf of an entire group of people, or even the public as a whole. The goal isn't just to win that one case, it's to use the court as a giant lever for broad social change. You see, this whole process is fundamentally forward-looking. You start with a big, systemic problem. For instance, there was this famous case in India involving Aruna Shanbag, a woman who was in a vegetative state for decades. The issue wasn't just about her, it was about the lack of rights for all terminally ill patients. That legal action was used to force a national conversation that ultimately led to systemic reform, like legalizing passive euthanasia. See? The goal is to change the entire system for the future.
But this whole search for perfect, objective justice, it has its own dangers. I mean, what happens when we get so focused on finding a clean, quantifiable answer that we totally lose sight of the human element? A really famous case from the 1960s serves as a powerful cautionary tale about exactly that.
So back in the 1960s, in a case called People versus Collins, the prosecutors had a big problem. Their eyewitnesses just weren't very credible. So they tried something wild. They turned to math. They listed a bunch of characteristics of the suspects, assigned a probability to each one, and then multiplied them all together.
And their final number was stunning. They argued that the odds of another couple matching that exact description were just 1 in 12 million. Faced with a number like that, what could a jury do? It seemed totally open and shut.
But the conviction was overturned. And why? Because that math, as impressive as it sounded, was basically a house of cards. The prosecutor had literally just made up the probabilities out of thin air with no real evidence. And even worse, he made a huge statistical mistake by assuming the characteristics were independent. For example, that a man having a beard has no bearing on whether he also has a mustache. That scientific certainty, it was all just an illusion.
This case is now the textbook example of a danger that legal scholars call the dwarfing of soft variables. It's this risk that one big, shiny number can completely overwhelm all the other soft, messy, human evidence. Things like how a witness behaves on the stand or whether a motive actually makes sense. We just get so dazzled by the supposed certainty of math that we forget to think critically about the rest of the story.
And that brings us right back to today, doesn't it? In our age of big data and AI, the temptation to just trust the numbers, to basically have a trial by algorithm, is stronger than it has ever been. The lesson from that flawed case back in the 60s has never been more relevant. As we move forward, the challenge is crystal clear. How do we use these incredible new tools without letting them completely dwarf our own reason and our own empathy? How do we build a legal system that delivers not just verdicts, but real justice?